Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Pratik and I will be taking up the News Today discussion for 24th October. So we have 5 main news followed by 7 or 8 quick updates. In the main news, the first news is about cloud seeding in Delhi. So here we'll discuss the idea of cloud seeding, what exactly it is, and what are the mechanisms that are associated with cloud seeding. We'll also discuss some of the benefits and concerns with respect to cloud seeding. Second news is about telecommunications, telecom cyber security amendment rules. So here we'll discuss the necessity for this amendment and what exactly are the features that are required here. In the third news, we'll talk about government asks CJI to recommend a successor. So here we'll discuss the whole idea of the process that is required for appointment of Chief Justice of India and what exactly are the precedents set, and especially with respect to the collegium system and all. In the fourth news, we'll talk about RBI warns geopolitical tensions could disrupt cross-border payment flows. So here we'll discuss what exactly is cross-border payment flows and what are some of the challenges identified by RBI in this report and some of the response undertaken by world at the global level and also by India. In the fifth news, we'll talk about the pre-election populist spending, where one of the report has identified that state governments are spending as much as 68,000 crores rupees in 8 states. So in this context, we'll discuss the necessity and some of the challenges associated with this aspect. Then in the personality news, we'll be covering Sri Narayan Guru and we'll also have certain quick updates as well. So let us start with the very first news, which is about cloud seeding. And the news is that experts have successfully conducted a trial test on cloud seeding in Delhi. And this is done particularly in Burari area. And the Delhi CM has also announced that the first cloud seeding event is expected in the coming week, especially around the time of October 28, 29, etc. So here this is important from the perspective of GS paper 3 environment. And in this we'll be understanding what exactly is the mechanism of cloud seeding and what are some of the ways in which it is induced and what are the benefits and challenges, right? So what is cloud seeding all about and why it is being suggested as one of the ways to address the pollution issues in the Delhi or in the Delhi NCR region. So cloud seeding is the way in which we provide certain incentive to the already existing cloud so that it can shed its droplets and induce rainfall, right? So it is essentially a mechanism or to introduce artificial rain. And it has several benefits. In fact, several countries also has adopted cloud seeding. For example, UAE has adopted cloud seeding to provide rainfall in certain moisture deficient areas, especially in the desert areas. China also uses cloud seeding. US and Canada have been using cloud seeding for providing water supply in certain mountainous regions. Australia also uses cloud seeding to provide moisture in the Tasmanian region. So cloud seeding is one thing that is prevalent across the world, and now India is also catching up with this whole framework of cloud seeding. Now the question is, how exactly cloud seeding work? So if you look at this diagram, this will make you understand how it works. So there are 3 processes involved here. First process is that some operations shoot silver iodide flares into the cloud from the ground. So there are 2 ways in which you can introduce certain elements into already existing cloud. So always remember that cloud seeding does not generate cloud. It can create rainfall only if there is a pre-existing cloud. Right? So it's a weather modification method to enhance rainfall or snowfall. So it is also applicable for the rainfall and as well as for the snowfall. And second condition that is required is that there has to be some sort of pre-existing cloud that is to be present. And for that to happen, then there is some elements that are introduced within the cloud that is already existing, and this can be introduced either through the ground, that is called ground generators. So this can be considered as ground generator. So within this ground, certain elements are provided, or certain seeding agents are provided. And these seeding agents can be silver iodide, that is AgI, potassium iodide Ki, sulfur dioxide SO2, and dry ice, that is carbon dioxide. Okay, so these seeding agents, especially the silver iodide, is very similar to water crystal, right? That is why it is able to hold on to the tiny droplets of water, right? So they are provided to the clouds either from the ground or from an airplane, right? So here you have two mechanisms, either from the ground or from the air. You provide certain seeding mechanism that acts as condensation nuclei. Now, already in the cloud, there would be certain droplets present, but these droplets are very tiny in nature, and as a result, they do not fall down because they're able to float in the cloud. Now, what the cloud seeding does is that it provides a molecule in which they can condense, or they can combine together, and once they combine together, they get heavier, and because of that, they start falling down, right? So second is that silver iodide helps form ice nuclei that can fall, or that can fail as rain or snow, and steal moisture from larger hail particles. Third, ice crystals fail, coming down as rain, snow, or small hail particles depending on the condition. So there are three processes, three-step process. First is that some operations, the either ground level or air-based operations are done to provide some condensation nuclei particles. Second is these particles start to condense or start to absorb the tiny tiny droplets, and once these droplets gets long enough or weigh enough, then they starts falling down towards the ground, coming as rainfall. So this is the mechanism. This is all about how cloud seeding works. Okay. Now, what are the benefits of cloud seeding? The first important benefit is that it helps in combating pollution, right? So why it helps in combating pollution? It helps in combating pollution because it spreads across the various particulate matters, right? It also helps in ensuring that the whole temperature inversion can be extended upward, right? So that the particulate matters or the elements that are present closer to the ground can spread both vertically and horizontally. Second is, it also supplements the natural water supply. So in the case of Delhi NCR, this is the reason that is provided to advance artificial rain in the city, right? But world across, it is not just used to combat pollution, but it is also used to supply additional natural water supply, right? As it is used in, say, UAE or in Australia or in Canada. But there are several concerns as well. First, there's lack of reliable information in terms of the cost efficacy, right? So we do not know to what extent it is going to be effective in providing water supply, how much cost is required, and what is the efficacy. Second, we also do not understand to what extent the seeding agents such as silver iodide or the potassium or these iodides that are being used are beneficial. So we do not know their impact on agriculture, we do not understand their impact on water bodies or any other thing, right? So these are the concerns because we do not have credible information regarding this effect. So this is also about issues with the seeding material, because again, this comes from this only, the first part only, because we do not understand the issues that they can have on various agriculture or biodiversity or water bodies. Third, it can also create environmental risk. So imagine if uh, a cloud seeding event is followed by another cloud burst event or some other event, rainfall event. So that would lead to flash flood, or that would lead to flooding at a very unprecedented level. So it can cause an environmental risk of a monumental level, right? So this is something that could be unintended consequence of artificial rain or cloud seeding, right? So apart from the benefits, we should also be aware of the concern. Now the question that arises today is, can we consider cloud seeding as the panacea for Delhi's air pollution? So to some extent we can, because some of the reasons why Delhi's air pollution happen is because of the internal reasons like vehicular pollution, and because of the fact that the wind is stagnant, and because of the temperature inversion things. So because of that, maybe to some extent cloud seeding will definitely work. But at the same time, there are certain structural reasons that we need to identify, such as stubble burning, such as instances of polluting industries, right? And behavioral issues. So maybe we need to also tackle those areas as well. So even though this is a very scientific approach to approach pollution, but at the same time, we also need to undertake structural reforms. We also need to undertake behavioral reforms. Take a look at this previous year question that came in this year, that is prelims of 2025. And the question was, artificial way of causing rainfall to reduce air pollution makes use of. Now we have already discussed this part, so let me know in the comment what could be the right answer. Next topic, telecommunications, telecom, cyber security amendment rules 2025. And this topic is largely focusing upon the GS paper 3 internal security, especially the cyber security part. And this is notified recently by Department of Telecommunication to amend the 2024 rules that were earlier provided. Now the context is not difficult to understand. The context is that even though the internet users in India have increased substantially, and because of that, we have also started to use UPI payments and other services a lot frequently. But at the same time, if you look at the number of cyber frauds, cyber issues or crimes that are being committed, it has also increased substantially. In fact, if you look at the data of cyber crimes or cyber frauds committed from 2022 to 2025, it has jumped nearly double. So in the 2022, the number of cyber crimes that were reported was around 10 lakh, but in 2025, it is close to 22 lakh. So there's a significant jump in the number of crime that is being reported, and more, there are more sophisticated ways of committing crimes. So it is very important that the government takes certain preemptive rule or act rules to ensure that this user is not disincentivized from using these digital payment system, etc. Right? So because of that, the government has now modified these rules to ensure that further protection is provided to the user, so that our Digital India mission can be further successful. So within this, there are certain modification that is being done. So what are these key highlights? First, a new term is introduced, that is telecommunication identifier user identities. Within this, new category has been mentioned, or new category has been added, which includes all those platforms that use mobile number as identifier. For example, when you enter your Zomato or your PhonePe or your Paytm or your Uber or any Uber or maybe Rapido IDs, you can log in or authenticate using mobile numbers, right? So all such platform or apps which uses mobile number as an identifier or an authenticator will be within this part, that is telecommunication identifier user entities, right? So they are under telecom-like regulation. So telecom, like your Airtel or Jio, they are under the regulation of the Department of Telecommunication. So now these platform has also come under regulation, and they are basically called as TIUEs, telecom identifier user identity entities. Second, and very important, is mobile number verification. So a government-run system will be there to verify the authenticity of the user mobile phone numbers. Third, telecom equipment regulation. So there are two components of using mobile phones. One is your number itself, and the second is that there is a unique identity given to all the mobile phones. That is your IMEI number. That is your International Mobile Equipment Identifier, that can be considered as the universal or maybe an Aadhaar of all the phone numbers. So just like an individual person has an Aadhaar or a unique ID, similarly, your mobile phone also has a unique ID. That ID is called as IMEI number, and this is used to track the theft of mobile phones. Now, this telecom equipment regulation will also be part of the overall regulation, where manufacturers are barred from reusing IMEI numbers which have been flagged by the telecom government or telecom regulators. They must also maintain databases of the tampered or restricted devices. So sometimes when someone use any mobile device or a restricted IMEI device number to say order something from Zomato, then that could be flagged, and then the notification can be given to the government, and then more action can be taken. So this is a very significant development as far as cyber security is concerned, because if you look at the cyber frauds that are currently happening, they are not targeting very sophisticated infrastructure or critical infrastructure, even though there are attempts on that, but they are mostly targeting people like you and me, people like those who do not have very sophisticated understanding of cyber processes, right? So these areas or these efforts are in a way to ensure that the common people are protected from cyber frauds. Now, if you look at the need for this, first obvious is that there is rising cyber security incidences, and we have already discussed that in 2022, the number of cyber security incidents that happened were close to 10 lakh, but it has risen to 22 lakh in 2024, which is reflecting the growing scale and complexity of digital threats. Second is effective verification. This whole process will also enable financial institutions and insurance firms to verify the details of customers while opening new accounts. As a result, it will also lead to faster delivery of services, and it will also lead to ease of doing business. Third is that it will also help in addressing the emerging threats. For example, the UPI is being targeted by fraudsters using compromised mobile numbers. So such kind of emerging threats can also be overcome. So this is the need for this amendment. If you look at the other measures to ensure telecom cyber security, one of them is with respect to financial fraud risk indicator, under which what happens is that Department of Telecommunication, it classifies the various suspicious number under categories of medium, high, or very high risk category, right? So whenever you receive number from such or call from such number, you can be very much assured that these people or this number is going to indulge in some sort of cyber fraud, right? So this basically awares the customer that to be wary of such numbers. So again, a very important initiative. The second one is with respect to DPDP Act, that is Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023. Within this, what has happened is that it has provided certain obligations on the data fiduciaries. So who are data fiduciaries? Data fiduciaries are those which are using your data. For example, if you post certain comments or use social media sites like Twitter or X or Instagram, then the social media websites or the fiduciaries have certain obligations. These obligations include that they will not use your data to give to some unsuspecting or to anyone else without your consent, right? So this is part of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, and this is in line with a very similar judgment that gave this right to privacy as fundamental right under Article 21, right? So more than 9.42 lakh SIM cards and 2.6 lakhs IMEIs linked to fraudulent activities have been blocked. So again, this is one of the good achievement within this framework. Let's move to the next news, that is Union government asks Chief Justice of India, CJI, to recommend a successor. And this is, of course, part of your GS paper 2 polity. And here we need to understand what is the process for appointment of Chief Justice of India, and how is it different from appointment of judges of Supreme Court and the judges of the High Court. What is the precedent and what is the evolution of this process, right? So as of now, the appointment is done through a process called Memorandum of Procedure that provides for the guidelines for appointing the CJI and other the Supreme Court judges, right? And the basic article that is important here to understand is Article 124, Clause 2, which I have taken from the Baer Act, which reads as follows. And this is Article 124, Clause 2 of the Constitution as taken from the Baer Act. Every judge of the Supreme Court shall be appointed by the President by warrant under his hand and seal. Then there is something mentioned in the brackets, and shall hold office until he attains the age of 65 years. Okay. So this is about the appointment of Supreme Court judge. It does not talk about the appointment of the CJI, or that is the Chief Justice of India. So how do we understand, or how do we make sense of that? Okay. And then this part will come to that, what exactly it talks about. So when it comes to the appointment of Chief Justice of India, and when it comes to appointment of the judges of Supreme Court, some different process is followed in India. So what is this process? So when it comes to CJI, it is done on the basis of seniority. Now you may be wondering what exactly seniority means here. Is it based on age? Or is it based on number of years of service? Okay, so it is not strictly related to age. Seniority also is not strictly related to number of years of service. The precise meaning of seniority here refers to years working as a Supreme Court judge, right? So it basically refers to seniority in terms of Supreme Court judge. So someone, when he or she gets appointed as a Supreme Court judge, from that date to the date on which the vacancy happened, whoever has the highest age before 65 years, he or she shall be considered as part of the most senior Supreme Court judge for CJI. And this is considered as part of convention. And what is convention? Convention means something that is followed not as a matter of law, but as a matter of practice, right? So this is basically a practice that we have been following from a very long time. And this is basically your seniority principle. But the next question is, has this process always been followed? The answer is no. This has been violated at least 3 times, right? 3 times this process of seniority has been violated. One in the 1960s, when Justice Imam became CJI, even though there was another judge who was senior to him that was there, but he became CJI because of the poor health of his predecessor, right? So Justice Imam became CJI because the one who was senior to him was not in a condition to become CJI because of health reason. But so this was not a controversial one at all. But the controversy happened during the appointment of Justice A.N. Ray in 1973. Okay, so Justice A.N. Ray became the CJI in 1973 despite 3 judges who were there who were senior to him. Then why this happened? This happened because of a very important judgment called the Keshwanand Bharati case, where the doctrine of basic structure was given. And I'm sure that all of you would be aware that doctrine of the Keshwanand Bharati case was announced in the context or with the majority of 7:6. It's a 13 bench judgment where 7 judges were in favor of doctrine of basic structure and 6 judges were against the doctrine of basic structure. So out of the 7, the senior most 3 were those who were in favor of doctrine of basic structure. And Justice A.N. Ray was here. So A.N. Ray wanted the parliament to amend all the section of the parliament without having to worry about the concept of doctrine of basic structure. Okay, so he was not in favor of doctrine of basic structure. As a result of this judgment, Justice A.N. Ray was elevated to the position of Chief Justice of India. So that was one incident, or the second incident. The third incident happened in 1970s, again late 70s, when Justice M.H. Beg was made CJI, even though another judge, Justice H.R. Khanna, was there, who was senior to Justice M.H. Beg. Now, this was again in response to a judgment that was given by Justice H.R. Khanna in the ADM Jabalpur case. ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkant Shukla case, where Justice H.R. Khanna went against the majority judgment. Now, you tell me, what was Justice or what was ADM Jabalpur case all about? So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there is a custom that the senior most Supreme Court judge would become the CJI, but this is not written in stone. It has been violated 3 times in the past, right? So this is also important from the perspective of prelims, that you know about these incidents as well. Moving on, let's take a look at the whole process. So here we have already discussed that it is discussed the principle for appointment of CJI is based on seniority and what exactly constitutes seniority. The second is that government initiates the process. So when we know that there is a limitation on the working condition or the working age of the CJI, that is 65 years of age. So 1 month before the retirement of the CJI, government initiates this process where government seeks the response of the CJI, that who should be the successor of the CJI, right? So this is recommendation is given by the CJI. Okay, so CJI, this is again something that is mere formality, because in most of the cases the CJI provides the name of the person who is next in the line with respect to seniority. Then the name is given to the government. It goes for the approval of the president. So once it is given to the president approves it, and then under his hand and seal, the CJI is appointed by the president, right? So this is how the process happens with respect to the appointment of the CJI. But the same is not followed with respect to the Supreme Court judges. So with respect to Supreme Court judges, there's a process called collegium that is taken up for the appointment of judges. So what exactly is the process of appointment? So here, if you look at this article 124 clause 2, it says that every judge of the Supreme Court shall be appointed by the president by warrant under his hand and seal, and shall hold office until he attains the age of 65 years of age, right? So here there is a condition that the president shall consult, the president is supposed to consult the CJI, right? And once the consultation happens, the CJI will provide certain names and the other judges will be appointed. But the question comes, does consultation means concurrence? Which means that, so whatever the CJI says, is president bound to accept that advice? That was the question that was raised in 1981. in the SP Gupta case that was referred to as first judge's case, where it was decided that the executive will have prominence over deciding the appointment of judges. So concurrence was not supposed to be, or not equal to consultation was not equal to concurrence, which means that president has discretion to accept or appoint judges which are not concurred by the CJI. But it went for a different or change in 1993 in a very second case called Supreme Court's Advocate on Record versus Union of India, where it was decided that consultation means concurrence, which means that whatever CJI provides as a name, that would be considered as list of judges. But here, the whole approach or the names provided by CJI itself will not constitute as the concurrence of the judge, but here the opinion of collegium has to be provided. So in the second judge case is the one case where the idea of collegium started to take place. Okay, so there the concept of collegium started to take place, and here it was decided as CJI plus 2 senior most judges. They will provide their opinion with respect to appointment of judges, and then the president is bound to take or accept that advice. Again, in 1998, there was a presidential reference under Article 143, which also sought clarification in this case, and then Supreme Court again provided this clarification that we accept the judgment given in the second judge's case, but we just want to add one thing, that for us collegium will mean not the opinion of just 2 judges, but here we'll be adding 2 more judges, that is 4 senior most judges will be counted as collegium along with the CJI. Okay, so this is how the whole evolution of CJI has happened in our country, right, with respect to the appointment of Supreme Court. But on the other hand, for the High Court judges, the requirement is CJI plus 2 senior most judges, right? So that is the difference between appointment of Supreme Court and High Court judges in India. So under High Court judges are appointed under which article? It is appointed under Article 217. Next, what are the concerns related to the judicial appointment collegium system? First, there is lack of transparency. We are not aware of the deliberations or the debates that is happening with respect to the appointment of who are being appointed as the judges or nominations, right? Then there is also a concept, or there is a criticism called uncle judge syndrome, where most of the time the judges recommend the names of their family or friend members, right? So again, because of the lack of transparency, there is no way in which we'll be able to identify what was the reasons that impelled the judges to give name of some judges, right, for appointment. Then there's problem of accountability. There's no formal mechanism to review the collegium decisions, limited executive role, so there is concentration of power within the judiciary. In fact, if you look at the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, that was done to overcome these limitations, where NJAC was established, that is National Judicial Appointment Commission, right? So this is how UK also appoints judges, right? So we have a topic called comparison of constitution with that of other countries. So we should also be aware about the practices that are happening in other countries. So US has a different way of appointing judges. UK has a different way of appointing judges. So in UK, this process is followed, where they have a judicial appointments committee, which consists of executive and other legal members and non-legal members to recommend the number of to recommend the judges, and then it is voted by the parliament, and then finally judges are appointed. So in India also this this mechanism was tried to be followed, but it was struck down by the judiciary in a very important case called the fourth, or it was called as fourth judge's case, in which the collegium system was retained, and this was struck down on the basis of the fact that judicial independence is the basic structure of the constitution, and through 99th amendment the parliament is abridging the basic structure of the constitution. So again, this was a very controversial decision, and a lot of people have written against this, but still as of now we are still following the collegium system. Now, if you look at the PYQ, UPSC has asked a very similar question or theme this related to this appointment of judges. For example, take a look at this. Discuss the evolution of the collegium system in India. So we have already discussed this. Critically examine the advantages and disadvantages of the system of appointment of the judges of the Supreme Court of India and that of USA. So in UK, we have discussed it is done through Judicial Appointment Commission. But in US, there is a different process. In US, first, presidents nominates judges. This is the first process. Then these judges names are sent to the Senate. So Senate is basically the upper house of the US Parliament, and it has 2 members or 2 seats per state, which means that it has a strength of 100. In general, it has 100 seats, plus it may have seats from Washington, DC as well, but we can consider it to be 100. So these Senate will question or probe the judges on various values or various judgment that they have given, and they will have a discussion with respect to the constitutional ideas or things like that, so that they understand the personality, the ideologies of the judges in a better way. After that, once this process is followed, then it is followed by voting. And what is the voting required? The vote that is required is a simple majority, that is half of 100 plus 1, that is 51. Earlier, the majority that was required was 60, but now there has been an amendment which has made this appointment of judges simpler in US. So once they get a simple majority by the Senate, then appointment happens. Then those people whose name has been appointed by the president becomes the judge. Okay, so this is the process that is followed. Now you can identify what is the pros and cons of this here. Pros can be that it involves different stakeholders. It involves executive, it also involves legislature. So it involves multiple stakeholders. There's also detailed investigation, there's detailed inquiry on the personality, on the character, and on the ideology. So it also brings out all those details in the public domain. At the same time, we can see that it could be very much political in nature, because if you look at the appointment that has happened under Donald Trump or any other president, it is highly political in nature, right? So in a way, we can say that in India, even though there is some sort of issue of transparency and accountability, we can still say that judicial independence in India is comparatively higher compared to what is witnessed in United States, right? So this could be given as some of the arguments of this particular question that came in 2025 mains. Right, so let's take a look at the next question, that is RBI warns geopolitical tensions could disrupt the cross-border payment flows. Of course, this is part of GS paper 3 polity. So recently, the RBI has come up with a biannual payments system report in which it has flagged certain issues that could have a very detrimental impact on the payment system, especially the international payment system. And these problems or challenges are sanctions, currency restrictions, and other operational barriers, right? Now, payment system is very important component of national economy or economic growth, because payment essentially involves changes of various values, right? So it essentially about settlement, and it's also an indicator of inclusive growth, because through payment, government can initiate several welfare means, and it can also lead to better ease of doing business, right? And with respect to international payment, India has a huge stake with respect to the remittance system, because if you look at the remittance number that we get internationally, it is close to $137 billion, which is almost 2 times higher than the second country which gets in terms of remittance, that is Mexico, right? So we are getting a lot of remittances, and any disruption with respect to the payment system can create a huge havoc with respect to our remittances and other areas. So let's take a look at what exactly are cross-border payment. So basically, cross-border payment means payment across different political boundaries, right? Where the payer, those who are paying for the service, and the recipient, those who are getting this remittance or any kind of services, they are based in different countries. And there are two types of payments. One is wholesale cross-border payment, and it is essentially done under various financial institutions or banks. Secondly, there is retail cross-border payment, which is done typically between individuals and businesses, or individuals and individuals in terms of remittances, right? And there could be person to business, etc. What is the significance of cross-border payment? It increases international mobility of goods and services. Capital and people has contributed to growing economic importance. In terms of status, India remains the top recipient of global foreign remittances with a record 137.7 billion inflow in 2024. The second largest is the country that gets it is Mexico. So what are the challenges with cross-border payment? So there are two types of challenges primarily. One is operational challenges, which all of these explain. Apart from the operational challenges, there are ideological challenges, or you can say that there are substantive challenges. So recent sanction by US, for that matter, or the problems that are happening because of Russia-Ukraine war or Israel-Hamas war, that could be considered as substantial limitation. And apart from that, there are procedural limitations or operational limitations, which can be classified as three categories. First, with respect to lengthy transaction chains involving different intermediaries, which increases cost and processing time. Second, lack of interoperability due to fragmented data standards. So different banks or different financial institutions have different ways of maintaining data. So there is some sort of problem of interoperability. And third is with respect to complex compliance checks, dependency of legacy technology platforms, limiting speed, transparency, and efficiency. So as of now, we only have SWIFT, right? That is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transcommunication or Telecommunication. So in a way, we have legacy technology platforms which are dependent on very few countries, right? So when these countries decide to impose sanction on certain other countries, then other countries who wants to do business with that particular country has to fall in line, because otherwise they would be outside the legacy platform. So again, that creates a huge hurdle, procedural and substantive, when it comes to the payment, or especially the cross-border payment system. So what are the initiatives to overcome this? So there are two ways in which we can look at it. One is towards the global initiatives, and what are the response undertaken by India. So with respect to the global roadmap, we have G20 global roadmap, which addressing challenges like high cost, slow speed, limited access, and insufficient transparency. So they have provided a roadmap to overcome all these problems. Then we have BIS Innovation Hub projects, and these projects can be Project Hertha, Project Rialto, Project Agora, etc. So these are taken by BIS, that is Bank for International Settlements. So they are basically innovation projects. Third is recommendation of Financial Stability Board and the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure, that is CPMI, etc. When it comes to Indian initiative, the most important one is bilateral or multilateral collaboration linking UPI with foreign fast payment system, FPSs, of other countries via QR code acceptance of UPI at merchant location abroad. And within this, there have been several initiatives where UPI and PayNow of Singapore are now collaborating. And there's another project called Project Nexus, where it's a multilateral project where there is some sort of collaboration with linking UPI with that of foreign fast payment system of a bunch of countries, right? So these are some of the initiatives undertaken by India to overcome the cross-border payment issues. Next news, RBI warns state governments against pre-election populist spending. And this is part of GS paper 3 economy. So RBI has cautioned that state governments against excessive pre-election spending, highlighting the risk it poses to macroeconomic stability and fiscal discipline. And it is very clear what the problem is, because see, state has limited capacity when it comes to finances. It does not have all the money in the world, it has limited money. Say it has 100 rupees to spend. Now it can spend on things like health, education, it can spend on infrastructure like road, it can spend on issues like law and order. Then maybe if it has enough resources, it can also spend on certain welfare schemes that it is undertaking. But imagine a scenario where the government that already has financial burden is investing heavily on the welfare schemes. Now, if the welfare scheme is undertaken at a very high level, especially on the hope that people will vote for them because of those welfare scheme, it is going to compromise on its other priorities, especially with respect to public infrastructure, with respect to health, education, and other social sector initiative. So it is very prudent that the state does not use its finances to attract voters, right? It is essentially to invest in the long-term measures and not to indulge in short-term measures or short-term populist measures. So that is what the RBI report talks about. Now this, what is the pre-populist spending? It means that government spending before elections. And what is the aim of these spending? It is for political gain rather than long-term development like health, education, skill development, etc. But it is for some conspicuous spending. And what are the forms that they take? It can be in terms of freebies, so your government gives something with free of cost. It can be subsidies, so it will provide items at lower cost. It could be food items, or it could be, say, power, anything, electricity, etc. Or it could be direct benefit transfer, where the government will straight away provide the cash to the poor people or to certain section of the people without any condition. For example, there was Ladki Behin Yojana launched in Maharashtra, which that was for 1100 crores or 11,000 crores, right? And then recently, we know that there is Bihar elections that is to happen in November. And for that, the government has launched Mahila Rozgar Yojana. And before that, in MP, the BJP government had launched this Ladli Behna Yojana, right? So again, it was for 8,000 crore, it is for 9,000 crore, and this is for 12,000 crore. So see how much money they are spending for these measures. And even though there is some merit to that, because ultimately this will lead to some money in the hand of poor women that will enable them to use it for some better moves. But again, it is coming at the cost of some other important developmental measures. If you look at the scale, as per a recent report by Indian Express, they have identified that 8 states together have spent as much as 68,000 crore rupees in this span of year, just in the span of 2023 to 2025 on the populist schemes, where the topmost state is Maharashtra, followed by Bihar. Okay, so Maharashtra and Bihar are at the top when it comes to pre-populist spending. In fact, for Bihar, it is around 1/3 of the tax revenue pre-election. So 1/3 of the money is spent on the populist schemes, like the Mahila Rozgar Yojana. See, so how will it be able to bridge the deficit? Already the Maharashtra government is is struggling to finance this, and because of that, it is taking up resources from other important government schemes and other projects, right? So what should be the way ahead, and what could be the impact? So definitely one is that it will lead to fiscal stress and it will lead to fiscal deficits and higher borrowing by the government, That is true. Second is that it will also lead to inflation. What kind of inflation? It will lead to demand push inflation, because there will be more money in the hand of people and the supply will more or less will be same. That will lead to demand pull inflation, pushing prices up. Then there will be debt burden. Short-term populist measures often result in higher public debt, and this debt is going to come at the cost of the future generation. In fact, Punjab's debt already touches 3.74 crore by the end of 2024-2025, which is a significant number. Then it also leads to resource misallocation. It diverts funds from the essential development projects like health, education, infrastructure development, etc., and long-term welfare programs. What should be the way forward, right? So we know the problems, so what should be the solution? First is fiscal prudence and debt management. Implement sustainable welfare schemes with sunset clauses. So yes, it is important that we can have some welfare scheme depending on different states. So states are competent to decide what is good for them or for the people themselves, but there should not be a scheme that should be allowed to run indefinitely. There should be some sort of sunset clause, which means that these schemes should come to a natural conclusion after a certain period of time. Second, there shall be some political consensus, which means that one party should not be allowed to provide for such scheme at this large level without consulting other political parties, right? So center and states, along with other states or the other political parties, should also consult to collaborate to ensure that there is there's no misuse of the freebies. Third, Election Commission should also play a very important role, which should ensure transparency and accountability in electoral promises. Fourth, voter awareness. Citizens should be educated on the long-term economic consequences of the freebies. Again, some of them could be a wishful thinking, but again, we need to have certain mechanism that ensures that the hard-earned money of the people are not spent on such ways, right? Anyway, let's talk about the personality in news. And here we'll talk about Sri Narayan Guru and why he was in news, because the President of India inaugurated the observance of Mahasamadhi centenary of Sri Narayan Guru at Kerala. So who was Narayan Guru? Sri Narayan Guru was born in 1856 and he died in 1928. He was born in Shempazanthi, which is near present-day Thiruvananthapuram, to Ezwaha family. And he was a saint, philosopher, poet, and social reformer. So primarily he is known as a social reformer who was very much against the caste system, just like E.V. Periyar or Ramaswamy Naicker. So he was also very much against the caste system. So if we want to know about the key contribution, first, he emphasized the principle of one caste, one religion, one God for all human beings. Second, he also launched the Aruvipuram movement, and that was for the equal rights to the temple entry. And especially, he lent support for the Viacom Satyagraha for the temple entry in Travancore region. In fact, if you look at the works which he was known for, it was Anukamba Dashakam, Brahma Vidya, Panchakam, etc. So in terms of value that we can learn from him, so if a question comes in ethics that what values can we learn from the lives of Sri Narayan Guru, we can write about equality, and we can also emphasize this principle, that what exactly he said with respect to equality. Then non-violence, so not just equality, but so this was the end, equality was the end, but the means was non-violence, right? Compassion for everyone, for not just human beings, but also for animals, integrity, courage, etc. So these were some of the major value that we can take away from his life. Next, we'll talk about the quick updates. So within this, the first one is International Convention Against Doping in Sport. Here, why it was in news? Because India was re-elected as the vice president of this agency. And this was basically a bureau for the Asia Pacific. And this was done at the 10th Conference of Party meeting of the International Convention Against the Doping in Sport. And which country was elected as the chairperson? It was Azerbaijan. Now, what exactly is the convention? It was adopted by UNESCO in 2005 and it came into force in 2007. What is the aim of International Convention Against Doping in Sport? To harmonize anti-doping legislation. So this means that every country should have same principles of determining what constitute doping. So for example, if the threshold of an athlete from India is different as compared to the threshold that is there for some other athlete from, say, Singapore, so we must have a similar platform or similar way of measuring the uniform level of doping quantity, right? So it should not be different for different countries, it should be uniform. Then there shall be regulation. So how do we measure this? What should be the process for that? And rules internationally. And what is the purpose? The purpose is to ensure a level playing field so that nobody gets an unfair advantage. And there are 192 countries which are parties to this convention. And of course, India is a signatory because India is now the vice president of this convention. Fine. Second news, duty-free tariff preference scheme. Now, why this was in news? Because recently it was observed that India offers the largest market access to the least developed countries. And it has also overtaken European Union and China in this regard. Now, how this has come into effect? It is because of this particular scheme. So recently WTO has credited India's duty-free tariff preference for boosting the LDC exports. So LDC's countries, the global south countries have been able to do really well in exports because of a particular scheme by India. So what happens within this scheme? So it was introduced in 2008 and it provides duty-free or preferential tariff treatment. So either it does not take any import, it uses any duty, or it has preferential tariff treatment. So the duty will be very minimal. For which countries? Countries that are imported from LDCs into India. And the scheme aims to boost LDC's economic growth, diversify exports, and strengthen trade relations. So it is a very important aspect of India's Global South initiative or South-South cooperation. So India does not just walk the talk, India also talks that, sorry, India does not just talk the talk, India also walks the talk. Okay. Next is about LRM, liberalized remittance scheme. And this is in news because India's outward remittance. So recently we just discussed that India gets the highest inward remittance, around $137.7 billion. But what is the status of India's outward remittance? So here it presents a paradox because the outward remittance for India, especially with respect to overseas education, has fallen to an 8-year low under this liberalized remittance scheme. And the reasons are not difficult to understand. It is because of these stringent conditions imposed by several developed countries, including US, with respect to immigration, with respect to education, with respect to all these aspects, right? So because of that, now more and more Indians are preferring to stay in the country and less and less students are going abroad. So what exactly is LRMS or LRS, Liberalized Remittance Scheme? So this was launched in 2004. So before that, before Liberalized Remittance Scheme was launched, there was a limitation under which you could not invest or you could not have engage in certain transaction with respect to international currencies, right? So in 2004, so there was a very limited range in which you can buy foreign products, both capital assets or current assets. But now this range was expanded considerably in 2004. In fact, the range was up to USD to 250,000, right? So it was intended to simplify and streamline the process of remitting funds outside India, because India was opened up in 1991, and after this time 10 years or 13 years have already passed, and India was more comfortable in the fact that India can now engage in the capital or in the current account trading, right? So all resident individuals, including minors, are allowed to freely remit up to USD 250,000 per financial year for any permissible both current or capital account. So current basically means some uh, day-to-day expenses or some consumption-based expenses, and capital means some long-term expenses, right? Or a combination of both. So both are allowed. There are no restrictions on the frequency of remittances under it, only the total amount is fixed. But at the same time, it is not available to the corporates, partnership firms, Hindu undivided family, trust, etc. For them, there are different norms available. Next news, Defense Acquisition Council. So DAC has recently cleared proposals worth rupees 79,000 crores to enhance the capability of armed forces, under which several warheads have to be will be acquired by the armed forces. So when it comes to DAC, what we need to understand is that it is an overarching structure for strategic defense acquisition planning. So before DAC, the acquisition of defense equipments in India was not very much regularized, and it was full of problems of transparency, lack of transparency, accountability, and it also fostered a lot of corruption issues. So with the imposition of, or with the onset of DAC, these problems have essentially been very much resolved, because it is ensuring coordinated decision making, it is taking strategic defense acquisition, and the whole process is very transparent in nature. It of course work under the chairmanship of Union Ministry of Defense, and the functions are three functions: gives approval for capital acquisitions in the long-term perspective plan. Second, it monitors the progress of major projects. And third, it grants acceptance of necessity, that is AON, for acquisition proposals, right? Next is about Carabit beetle. And this was there, this was figured in a very recent report by The Hindu, in which it said that a recent study has revealed that Carabit beetles can serve as bioindicators to track soil microplastic pollution. Because interestingly, these beetles are able to consume the soil, the microplastic as well. So in a way, their population would indicate the presence of microplastic as well. So now tell me, what exactly is bioindicators, and apart from this, what are the examples that we can give for bioindicators? Now with respect to Carabid beetles, they belong to the family Carabidae, commonly known as ground beetles. They are nocturnal predators. Basically, they are operational during the night, and they feed on pests like slugs, caterpillars, and snails. They are found almost in all the terrestrial habitats across the world, right? Excise ocean sky. So this is important because the Indian Air Force recently joined Excise Ocean Sky, and in which area, in which country? It is in Spain. So this is a multinational air exercise hosted by Spanish Air Force, right? So it's not a bilateral air exercise, it's a multinational air exercise and hosted by Spain. What is the aim? Aim is enhancing interoperability, sharpen air combat skills, and foster mutual learning. The significance is, and this is what it is important, is that this is the first time a non-NATO member country is participating in this exercise. And this also highlights the significance of India-Spain ties. Now you tell me, which are the countries which have recently joined in NATO, right? Okay. So this is all about the news today for 24th October. I hope this was useful to you. Let me know in the comment what would be the answer of the question that is popping up in front of your screen. Till then, all the best. Thank you.